The state of Virginia, which now includes West Virginia, formed in 1861 and unionized in 1863, was considered a large haunted territory by the Native Americans. Paranormal investigators have determined that Ohio may very well be the most haunted place in America. Ohio and its surrounding states have what some researchers call the most amount of ghost legends, the exception being Louisiana, particularly New Orleans. Southeast Ohio and northern West Virginia, which may be the two most haunted places, border each other, separated by the Ohio River. Point Pleasant's famous Silver Bridge is one of the bridges that connect these two places. The Native Americans said hundreds of years ago that this place was haunted, and hundreds of years later, the accumulation of ghost legends by white settlers and the research of paranormal investigators seem to confirm this notion. One of the strangest and most popular paranormal sightings took place in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, between 1966 and 1967, the sighting of Mothman. Mothman. Who is he? What is he? What does he want? And what evidence is there for his existence? It all began in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, but before I go into details of the Point Pleasant Mothman sightings, I should note that Mothman has appeared at the site of a bridge collapse in the early 1900s and just before the Great Chernobyl nuclear accident, though most Mothman sightings all came from one place, and in one time period. In 1966, Point Pleasant became a hotbed of UFO and paranormal activity. Many people witnessed flying or hovering lights. Most famously, they were spotted over an old abandoned TNT warehouse. The first Mothman sighting possibly occurred in the early 1960s, when a woman driving her car through a park known as Chief Cornstalk Hunting Grounds slowed after she saw a figure in the road. According to the woman, the figure had two large wings and took to the air. I have only heard this report from one source. The first sighting is typically dated as November 12th. On November 12, 1966, near Clendenin, West Virginia, 5 men were in a local cemetery that day, preparing a grave for a burial, when something that looked like a brown human being lifted off from a nearby tree and flew over their head. The men were baffled. It did not appear to be a bird, but more like a man with wings. Late in the evening of November 15, 2 young married couples had a very strange encounter as they drove past the abandoned TNT plant near Point Pleasant. The couple spotted 2 large eyes that were attached to something that was, quote, shaped like a man, but bigger, maybe 6 or 7 feet tall, and it had big wings folded against its back. When the creature moved towards the plant door, the couples panicked and sped away. Moments later, they saw the same creature on the hillside near the road. It spread its wings and rose to the air, following with their car, which by now was traveling at over 100 miles per hour. "That bird kept right up with us," said one of the group. They told Deputy Sheriff Millard Halstead that it followed them down Highway 62 and right to the Point Pleasant city limits, and they would not be the only ones to report the creature that night. Another group, of 4 witnesses, claimed to see the "Birdman" 3 different times. Another report from that evening came from a man named Noel Partridge, who claimed that his television went to static and emitted a strange whining sound, similar to a generator winding up. Noel's dog, who was on the front porch, began barking. Noel grabbed a flashlight to find out what the commotion was. His dog was barking at something near the hay barn not far from the house. When Noel turned on his flashlight to have a better look, he seen a creature whose eyes shined red, like bike reflectors, and his dog took off after the creature. Noel went into his house and grabbed his gun, not daring to go back outside. His dog didn't return. He read the report in the newspaper 2 days later regarding the strange sightings near the TNT plant, and became frightened when he read that Roger Scarberry, one of the people who spotted Mothman, seen the body of a dog alongside of the road on their way to Point Pleasant, and a few minutes later the dog was gone. They even got out of the car to look for the dog, but they couldn't find it. Noel immediately thought of his dog Bandit, that had been missing. Bandit never returned. A press conference was held on November 16. The 2 young couples who reported the sighting the day before repeated their story to the press. Deputy Halstead, who knew the couples, stated that the couples were good people and trustworthy. He believed them. Many of the reporters felt the same way. Also on November 16th, the Thomas family who had lived near the TNT plant spotted a red light in the sky. They knew it wasn't an airplane, but they couldn't identify it. Mrs. Bennett, a friend of the Thomas family, and who had witnessed the light in the sky from her house, then drove to the Thomases' house. When she got out of the car with her small daughter in arms, she seen a figure moving around the car. She said it seemed as though it had been lying down. It rose up slowly from the ground. A big gray thing, bigger than a man, with terrible glowing eyes. The event was so frightening she dropped her daughter, then recovered, picked up her kid, and ran inside the Thomases' house, where they locked themselves in and contacted the authorities. The creature was gone by the time the authorities got there. Mrs. Bennett would not recover from the incident for months, and was in fact so distraught that she sought medical attention to deal with her anxieties. She was tormented by frightening dreams, and later told investigators that she believed the creature had visited her own home too. She said that she could often hear a keening sound, like a woman screaming, near her isolated home on the edge of Point Pleasant. The sightings continued for months throughout the Point Pleasant area. The mystery and fear surrounding the strange bird-like monster came to a head on December 15, 1967, with the tragic collapse of the Silver Bridge. 46 people died when the bridge, which connected Point Pleasant with Gallipolis, Ohio, collapsed during rush hour. The destruction was blamed on a dysfunctional eye bar in the suspension chain, but some locals felt that something more sinister was at play, and that it might be connected to the recent reports of the eerie creature. Theories arose that Point Pleasant might have been a portal to an alternate realm, and that the Mothman creature, coupled with reports of UFOs, poltergeist, and bizarre light phenomenons, was all somehow connected to the Silver Bridge tragedy. Some wondered if Mothman was responsible for the Silver Bridge destruction. Others speculated, despite Mothman's frightening appearance, he may have been sent to warn the town of impending tragedy. John Keel interviewed people in Point Pleasant about Mothman, and in 1975 published the book The Mothman Prophecies, which became a movie in 2002. There are so many sightings that took place in that one year. If I tried to read them all to you, we'd be here all day. The TNT plant, where many people spotted Mothman, would have made an excellent hideout. The area was surrounded by 3.6 thousand acres of woods and consisted of high concrete domes that once housed high explosives in World War II. The area was filled with many tunnels described as honeycombs, which would have allowed for a lot of flightless travel for the creature if it chose to move flightless and unseen. The area also consisted of the wildlife station filled with dense forest and artificial ponds to accommodate wildlife. Whether Mothman was a person, a type of bird, alien, or supernatural, this would have made an ideal spot to nest. In that year, Point Pleasant, West Virginia would have hundreds of sightings of UFOs, men in black, Mothmen, and other strange occurrences such as cars losing all power suddenly, television and radio disturbances, all sort of electronic devices shutting off. Some people believe that lights in the sky, men in black, sudden power disruptions of electronic devices, Mothman, and the collapse of the Silver Bridge were all linked events. I will say this, the Silver Bridge collapse was the greatest bridge disaster in American history. A great deal of effort was spent fishing out of the river every part of that bridge, examining every part thoroughly, and determining that a defective eye-bar was to blame. I spent roughly 4.5 hours reading through the details of the bridge, its collapse, and the insane amount of tests run on the eye-bar. It appears a small amount of sulfur was present in the steel at the time it was being forged. Over the course of 39 years that the bridge stood, this weak eye-bar began having microfractures, which became small fractures, which caused pivoting in the eye-bar. And in freezing cold temperature, the eye-bar would have been at its most brittle, such as that December 15th winter when it collapsed. There can be no doubt the bridge collapsed because of a defective eye-bar. Now let's talk about explanations for Mothman. Something that very few people talk about in regards to Mothman is that Point Pleasant is the site of a famous curse dating back to the murder of Chief Cornstalk in the 1700s. And while this may not be a very scientific explanation, I feel it deserves to be mentioned. As the American frontiersmen began to move west in the 1770s, 7 nations of Indians, the Shawnee, Delaware, Wyandot, Mingo, Miami, Ottawa, and Illinois, formed a powerful confederacy to keep the white man from infringing on their territory. The Shawnee were the most powerful of the tribes, and were led by a feared and respected chieftain called Ketugua, which translates to meaning cornstalk. In 1774, when the white settlers were moving down into the areas of Ohio and Kanawha River, the Indian Confederacy prepared to protect their lands by any means necessary. The nations began to mass in a rough line across the point from the Ohio River to the Kanawha River, numbering about 1,200 warriors. They began to make preparations to attack the white settlers near an area called Point Pleasant on the Virginia side of the Ohio River. As word reached the colonial military leaders of impending attack, troops were sent in and faced off against the Indians. While the number of fighters were fairly even on both sides, the Native Americans were no match for the muskets of the white soldiers. The battle ended with about 140 colonials killed and more than twice that number of Indians. The tribes retreated westward into the wilds of what is now Ohio, and in order to keep the Indians from returning, a fort was constructed at the junction of the Kanawha and Ohio rivers. As time passed, the Shawnee leader, Cornstalk, made peace with the white men. He would carry word to his new friends in 1777, when the British began coaxing the Indians into attacking the rebellious colonies. Soon the tribes again began massing along the Ohio River, intent on attacking the fort. Cornstalk and Red Hawk, a chief of the Delaware tribe, had no taste for war with the Americans, and they went to the fort on November 7th to try to negotiate peace before fights began. Cornstalk told Captain Arbuckle, who commanded the garrison, that he was opposed to war with the colonists, but that only he and his tribe were holding back from joining on the side of the British. He was afraid that he would be forced to go along with the rest of the Confederacy. When he admitted to Arbuckle that he would allow his men to fight if the other tribes did, Cornstalk, Red Hawk, and another Indian were taken as hostages. The Americans believed they could use him to keep the other tribes from attacking. They forced the Native Americans into a standoff, for none of them wanted to risk the life of their leader. Cornstalk's name not only struck fear into the hearts of the white settlers up and down the frontier, but it also garnered respect from the other Indian tribes. He was gifted with great oratory skills, fighting ability, and military genius. In fact, it's said when his fighting tactics were adopted by the Americans, they were able to defeat the British in a number of battles where they had been both outnumbered and outgunned. Although taken as hostage, Cornstalk and the other Indians were treated well and given comfortable quarters, leading many to wonder if the chief's hostage status may have been voluntary in the beginning. On November 9th, Cornstalk's son, Eli Napisco, came to the fort to see his father, and he was also detained. The following day, Cornstalk and his son heard gunfire from outside the fort. It turns out that while some of the white men were hunting for food, they were ambushed by Indians. The soldiers, angry at the loss of their comrade, decided to take it out on the Indian captives. When the soldiers rushed into the detainment quarters, it is said that Cornstalk bravely stood up to them, ready to fight. This intimidated the soldiers who came to a pause, but Cornstalk's intimidating bravery didn't pause them for very long, and they opened fire on the captives. It took 8 gunshots to finally bring down Chief Cornstalk. And with his dying breath he said, "I was the borderman's friend. Many times I have saved him and his people from harm. I never warred with you, but only to protect our wigwams and lands. I refused to join your pale-faced enemies with the redcoats. I came to the fort as your friend, and you murdered me. You have murdered by my side my young son. For this, may the curse of the Great Spirit rest upon this land. May it be blighted by nature. May it even be blighted in its hopes. May the strength of its people be paralyzed by the stain of our blood." Since this event, in the past 100 years, Point Pleasant has suffered many disasters. 1907, the worst coal mining disaster in American history took place in Monaga, West Virginia on December 6th, when 310 coal miners were killed. In June of 1944, 150 people were killed when a tornado ripped through the tri-state triangular area. In 1967, the devastating Silver Bridge disaster sent 46 people hurtling to their death in the Ohio River on December 15th. It was the greatest bridge disaster in American history. In 1968, a Piedmont airline plane crashed near the Kanawha Airport, killing 35 people on board. On November 14, 1970, a Southern Airways DC-10 crashed into a mountain near Huntington, West Virginia, killing 75 people on board. In January 1978, a freight train derailed at Point Pleasant and dumped thousands of gallons of toxic chemicals. The chemicals contaminated the town's water supply, and the wells had to be abandoned. In April of that same year, the town of St. Mary's, just north of Point Pleasant, was struck with tragedy when 51 men who were working on the Willow Island power plant were killed, when their construction scaffolding collapsed. And the McClintock Wildlife Management Area, known as the TNT Area, the famous location of Mothman sightings, was declared by the EPA in the 1980s to be toxic due to TNT manufacturing, its ingredients, byproducts, and remaining supply left there from World War II. Yes, I just said remaining supply of TNT, which apparently was just left locked away in underground bunkers. The swamps, groundwater, and soil have been contaminated, and the contamination slowly spreading towards residential areas. A large cleanup began and was largely completed in 1997, but some of the damage is just too costly to fix. Between the chemical spill from the freight train accident and the TNT plant, that area has become very toxic, or at least before the EPA cleanup. Some have guessed that the toxic swamps and radioactivity in that area may have mutated a bird into what is being called Mothman. I would like to point out the unlikelihood of this. First, I have read the EPA report. There was no mention of radioactivity. Secondly, neither radiation or toxic waste has ever been demonstrated to cause gigantism, or beneficial mutations other than higher tolerance to a specific chemical. In theory, and in theory only, exposure to radiation or toxic waste could corrupt DNA, leading to a birth defect known as gigantism, which makes a person or animal larger than normal. While gigantism is a real thing, it has never been demonstrated by deliberate exposure to DNA corruption. DNA corruption that precedes exposure to toxins and radiation often manifests into disease, stillborn offspring, sterilization, cancer, organ failure, and various birth defects such as mental retardation and deformity. Exposure to radiation and toxic waste only causes beneficial mutations such as growing 10 times bigger than normal or having superpowers in comic books, not in real life. But here's something interesting I found which may directly relate to Mothman. A rare theory about Mothman being the Native American myth of the Thunderbird. The Thunderbird is a very popular myth among Native American tribes. Every tribe, or nearly every tribe, has heard of this creature and have their own interpretation of it. One interpretation is that the Thunderbird is a spirit that takes the shape of a bird, protects children, and punishes the morally wicked. Sometimes it takes the shape of a man and a bird, possessing physical attributes of both, such as being a tall-winged human. Could Mothman be the Thunderbird, conjured by the curse of Chief Cornstalk? Some believe so. However, I disagree. I cannot find the specific tribe or tribes that interpret the Thunderbird as being a man-bird or punishing the morally wicked. While there are many variants on the Thunderbird, the most common attributes describe the Thunderbird as being huge. Its flapping wings is where thunder comes from. The wind from its wings is why wind and thunder are experienced together, and its eyes shoot lightning. The Thunderbird is the Native American explanation for why storms happen, which is why a common belief is also that the Thunderbird does battle with the Sea Panther, the god of the underworld. This part of the legend may be in part an attempt to understand and explain the rising tide and chaotic ocean waves during a storm. Those are the primary characteristics, with additional characteristics added to the legend by various tribes. Now let's look at some more realistic possibilities. Let's start off with the most common description of Mothman. Shaped like a man, but with wings. Taller than a man, described mostly as between 5 and 7 feet tall, which ironically does include the human height range, but again, often described as larger than a man. Mothman has been described as bird-like. Large red glowing eyes, like bike reflectors. Large orange eyes that glowed red in the middle. Unusually long neck, or no neck, like its eyes were in its chest. Its body color is either brown or gray. Honestly, most of these descriptors describe a bird. Many others at the time and since the event have written these sightings off as bird sightings, guessing the bird was probably a large heron or sandhill crane, which is between 3 and 4 feet tall, wingspan of 6 to 7 feet. It does have orange around the eye, and the eye would be red reflective when you shine a light at it. Another bird that is frequently brought up is the great blue heron, standing at 4.5 feet and a wingspan of 6.6 feet. A certain type of owl has also been proposed. The great blue heron is a rare bird, but West Virginia is one of the states they have been known to exist in. The sandhill crane is more northern, such as Canada, but it is possible for birds to occasionally drift great distances from their normal migration. And considering the enormous distance birds can travel, It is possible for nearly any bird on the North and South American continent to end up anywhere on the North and South American continent, and some birds can actually travel to different continents. The California condor is another bird that is proposed as an explanation, but these amazing birds of the vulture family, while unbelievably big and frightening looking, are also incredibly rare. In 1965, it is alleged that there were less than 100 of these birds. Furthermore, the climate of West Virginia is too cold for the condor. It is highly unlikely a condor would leave its native habitat of California, Arizona, and northern Mexico to fly towards the colder east. However, none of these birds are 5 to 7 feet aside from their wingspan. The only birds that reach 7 foot or greater are flightless birds such as an ostrich, and due to being flightless could never migrate as far as West Virginia. Some believe it is a prehistoric bird thought to be extinct. There were a few flight-capable birds large enough to pick up a human being millions of years ago. However, if we consider that people are merely exaggerating its size, then the great blue heron and the sandhill crane could match most of the descriptions given. When you see something frightening, or you see something of unusual size, your mind often exaggerates how big it is. Practically everyone has seen a spider that was almost the size of a hand. We tend to exaggerate it in our mind, nearly twice the size it actually was. The reason for this is twofold. First, we are used to seeing tiny spiders whose leg span is no greater than a dime. Once in a great while we will see a spider the size of a quarter, but when we see that one spider, probably a 2-inch wolf spider, we swear the thing was about 4 to 6 inches. The second reason is, spiders creep us out, and things that we fear seem to be bigger than they actually are. And one more thing to take into consideration. If the creature is in mid-flight, we lose our point of reference. When cryptozoologists explored claims of impossibly large bird sightings, and many witnesses believed these to be prehistoric birds, an experiment was conducted with a kite. They flew a bird-shaped kite and asked spectators to guess how big it was.
So instead of seeing a giant bird flying at a high altitude, eyewitnesses could have seen a smaller bird flying much lower. This expert agrees.
Without a reference, I don't believe an individual can judge the size of a bird flying.
To test this assertion, Boyaja will work with Cliff Quinn, the American Kite Association's 2005 champion kite builder. After several attempts to get the enormous kite in the air, it is finally flying, soaring 300 feet above a small lake, with nothing nearby as a solid reference point. Passers-by are stopped and asked if they can judge the size of the kite from wingtip to wingtip.
18 feet. That bird's at least 100 feet wide.
I thought for sure that it was a very, very large eagle.
I was guessing between 30 and 35 feet.
And I'm going with 27.5 feet, which I'm pretty sure is the right guess.
After polling more than a dozen people, Boyaja and Quinn have proven one thing. On this day, nobody was able to accurately judge the size of the kite.
So Mothman's size, if he is just a bird, could be attributed to the aforementioned factors. Also, birds typically do have reflective eyes when you shine bright light at them, particularly owls because they have unusually large eyes that face forward. But what about the two different common claims, that it looked like its eyes were in its chest like it didn't have a neck, and the opposite claim that it had an unusually long neck? Well, if it were a crane, heron, or especially if it were the California condor, its very long neck may have been bent down while the head was facing up, making it appear that its head was parallel to its chest. The only thing in the common description that can't be explained by an unusually large bird is the statement over and over that it looked like a man. I can't really explain that one. A few of the reports claim this giant bird-like man began chasing them down the road as they sped away in their car, and how amazing it was that this creature could keep up with them at such a mighty speed. Well, it's not unusual that birds can hit 60 miles an hour when they're in attack flight. Many birds can hit an excess of 100 miles per hour. A few birds clock in at nearly 200 miles an hour, with a particular type of falcon setting the record at 247 miles per hour. Herons and cranes, and some owls, which are the three birds most attributed to these sightings, should all be able to keep up with a car for a minute or so. Unless you're pushing your turbocharged hot rod or exotic sports car to its limits, it's unlikely you're going to outrun these birds within just a minute. One of the first reports were of a young couple claiming it kept up with them at a speed greater than 100 miles per hour. In 1966, there would have been a fair amount of hot rods that could break 100 miles per hour, and the road they claimed to be on was long and straight, and the deputies seemed to believe their story. So it is likely they were telling the truth and their car did hit 100 miles per hour. So the question is, how fast can a sandhill crane or blue heron fly? I have spent a long time trying to find that out. All I can get is their cruising speed of 35 to 40 miles per hour, with one website erroneously claiming that was their top speed. Most birds cruise at a speed of 30 miles per hour. Even hawks and eagles that can go well over 100 miles per hour typically cruise around 30 to 40 miles per hour. So, I simply don't know if herons and cranes can match that speed, though it does seem unlikely. Most birds that can break the 100 mile per hour barrier typically end up on a world's fastest birds list. I have not found cranes or herons on that list. However, consider this. If the bird was merely flying at 85 or 90 miles per hour, and the car only briefly passed the 100 mile per hour barrier, but averaged 90 miles per hour, it is reasonable that they could not get too far away from the bird, and thus it kept up with them. Then there are the reports of electrical equipment acting up, many UFO sightings, and reports of men in black hounding witnesses. Let's talk about men in black. Men in black refers to government agents or alleged government agents who threaten UFO witnesses not to go public. They are described as intimidating, menacing, and acting not right, like they're out of place somehow. The Men in Black phenomenon is famous to UFO researchers. Its origin began in the 1950s, with a UFO journalist named Al Bender, who claimed he had discovered the truth about UFOs, but a higher source threatened him into silence. He shut down his paper called Space Review and dissolved his UFO research group. Later in an interview, he claimed that 3 men in black had confirmed his suspicions were true, gave him more information about UFOs, and then threatened him not to go public. A decade later, Bender published a book about it. It should be noted that Al Bender is not a credible source. He was a sensationalist whose income was based on publishing these shocking UFO articles, and his publication was failing. This seems like nothing more than closing down his failing business and going out with a bang by suggesting a government cover-up. But since then, UFO researchers have given plenty of testimony to men in black interviewing them, acting strange, and occasionally giving them threats, both subtle and obvious, to remain silent. The Men in Black stories have died down greatly since the publishing of the Will Smith movie Men in Black, which was based on the comic book, based on the urban legend started by Al Bender. Now that tales of Men in Black are met with giggles due to the movie, and jokes about their mind-erasing pins have become normal responses, there have been very little Men in Black occurrences. My explanation for many of the Men in Black stories is as follows. 1. Hoaxes made up by sensationalists. 2. Government agents, particularly with the Air Force, just trying to get answers when there's been a mass report of UFOs. These men, being military trained, are often large with a powerful and intimidating demeanor, can frighten nervous, paranoid conspiracy theorists and even average people who are already a little bit shaken by what they've seen. These men could be intimidating by accident. 3. Random strangers just dressed in black who are not with the government or anything, behaving in ways that are odd. Many people do dress in black. It's a common color scheme. And many people in this world do act weird. Ordinarily, the two don't get put together. But once you've spotted a UFO and read about these strange and intimidating men in black, your imagination goes into overdrive. Now if someone acts strange, and people always do, and they just happen to be dressed in black, which is pretty common, now suddenly you think of seeing strange men in black. None of the Point Pleasant UFO or Mothman witnesses, that I am aware of, claim that they were threatened into silence by these men in black. They only state that they observed strange behavior from men in black, or they felt uncomfortable around them. This only leaves one more part of the mystery not explained by birds. The failing electronic equipment, such as cars suddenly losing power, radios, hand radios, telephones, and televisions getting static or not working, or getting various forms of signal noise. Well, keep in mind these anomalies happen all the time, everywhere. It's just the nature of an electronic device. Although for that 1 year, it sure did seem to happen a lot in Point Pleasant. But did it really? When you look at the amount of reports, is it really an unusual amount? Before the public became whipped into a frenzy by all the reports of Mothman, UFOs, strange men in black hounding them with questions, and electronic device failure, is it possible that people got just as many device failures, but never made a mental note of it, and sure as heck didn't go around reporting it to people like it was some sort of national crisis? Who in the 1960s didn't miss their favorite ball game or TV show because they couldn't get a clear signal? Who in the 1960s didn't get a dropped phone call or a noisy reception when picking up the phone at least once? And who's never had a car just break down and stop running, or have all your dash lights go out when bouncing up and down on bumpy, winding West Virginia roads when a fuse busts or a wire comes undone? I believe the electronic disturbances can get chalked up to normal occurrences being magnified in the presence of mass hysteria. But what about all the other reports that can't possibly fit with the description of a bird? Well, maybe those are hysterical misrememberings or hoaxes. You can't believe that when a small, bored, sleepy town becomes bombarded with fantastic tales of UFOs and Mothman creatures, that there aren't going to come pouring in fictional tales. Some of these reports had to be nothing more than hoaxes. But what about the sighting of Mothmen at Chernobyl before the nuclear plant disaster? Well, it turns out those stories are false. According to cryptozoologist Lauren Coleman, all reports involving a large bird or bird-like creature were fabricated after the 2002 release of The Mothman Prophecies. The same is true regarding the other bridge in the early 1900s. The book, and subsequently the movie, may have been based on real events, but it was ultimately a work of fiction. So the fiction and the real story kinda got merged. But there are other explanations aside from just blaming it on bird spotting. Infrasound. Infrasound is any sound wave that is below 20 Hz. That's hertz, not kilohertz. 20 Hz is considered the normal low-frequency limit of human hearing. When pure sine waves are reproduced under ideal conditions and at very high volume, a human listener will be able to identify tones as low as 12 Hz. Below 10 Hz, it is possible to receive the single cycle of the sound, along with a sensation of pressure at the eardrums. Now let's talk about what that does. A human being exposed to this low frequency can experience restlessness, anxiety, and headaches. Some articles claim it can cause hallucinations. However, there is only one report of hallucinations, and it was nothing more than a brief gray blob out of the corner of a researcher's eye. That hardly constitutes an hallucination, at least not the way psychedelic drugs trigger complex hallucinations. Though research does give merit to infrasound being an explanation for haunted areas and ghost sightings. The following is from Wikipedia. Psychologist Richard Wiseman of the University of Hertfordshire suggests that the odd sensation that people attribute to ghosts may be caused by infrasonic vibrations. Vic Tandy, experimental officer and part-time lecturer in the School of International Studies and Law at Coventry University, along with Dr. Tony Lawrence of the University Psychology Department, wrote in 1998 a paper called Ghost in the Machine for the Journal of the Society for Psychical Research. Their research suggested that an infrasonic signal of 19 Hz might be responsible for some ghost sightings. Tandy was working late one night, alone in a supposedly haunted laboratory at Warwick, when he felt very anxious and could detect a gray blob out of the corner of his eye. When Tandy turned to face the gray blob, there was nothing there. The following day, Tandy was working on his fencing foil, with the handle held in a vise. Although there was nothing touching it, the blade started to vibrate wildly. Farther investigation led Tandy to discover that the extractor fan on the lab was emitting a frequency of 18.98 Hz, very close to the resonant frequency of the eye, given as 18 Hz by NASA. This, Tandy conjectured, was why he had seen a ghostly figure. It was, he believed, an optical illusion caused by his eyeball resonating. The room was exactly half a wavelength in length, and the desk was in the center, thus causing a standing wave which caused the vibration of the foil. Tandy investigated this phenomenon farther and wrote a paper entitled The Ghost in the Machine. He carried out a number of investigations at various sites believed to be haunted, including the basement of the Tourist Information Bureau next to Coventry Cathedral and Edinburgh Castle. Mythbusters did an episode about infrasound and its relation to people feeling afraid and perceiving areas as haunted.
Indeed, and to generate that hum,
these ain't no boom boxes.
Jamie's tracked down a supersized stack of speakers.
These speakers are clearly capable of making the whole building vibrate and the windows shake, which is what they're doing now. And we can't actually have any sounds that the test subjects can hear because that would skew the results. We've got an upper limit on the amount of volume that we can pump out of those speakers. This is interesting. I can't hear anything out of the ordinary. I do feel like there's something going on in me. It feels like I have butterflies in my stomach, or I'm really tired, but I've had too much coffee. It's sort of anxiety producing. I don't know about fear, but it's unnerving.
Now, to continue with the theory. After the Silver Bridge collapse, it was discovered that a faulty eye-bar was to blame. It has been established in a lengthy report that the eye-bar had considerable pivot that grew as the stress fractures grew. Based on that report, some have speculated that this constant pivoting could have emitted an infrasound, which affected everyone in the area, subjecting them to feelings of restlessness, anxiety, and hallucinations. This would explain why the sightings of Mothman simmered down quickly after the bridge collapse, and it would explain all the reports of strange men in black. The answer being that people's nervous systems were overloaded, causing manic or hypomanic behavior in some, and paranoia in others. Imagine when nervous, paranoid people observe goofy-acting hypomanic people. That's a recipe for people reporting strange behavior. We could write this entire thing off as bird sightings and mass hysteria, but what paranormal event can't be written off as misidentification of something and hysteria? If we are in search of the truth, then we owe it to ourselves to acknowledge that the Mothman legend has over 100 witnesses over a 13-month period, a great many of them not able to be written off as bird sightings. And we must acknowledge the poor evidence for the infrasound explanation. We do not know if the bridge was emitting an infrasound, and we do not know if the pivoting of an eye-bar could produce a pulsating infrasound, which would be capable of affecting a human being the same way as a continuous sine wave would. And there is no evidence that even under ideal circumstances, infrasound can produce complex hallucinations, not just that gray blob out of the corner of somebody's eye. And also that multiple people would not witness identical hallucinations at the same time. And there have been multiple witnesses at the same time. So we must admit that the infrasound explanation is pretty weak. And not all of these sightings could really just be a bird. And there are a lot of sightings to be calling just hoaxes. We must respect the 1960s Mothman sightings as a unique time of paranormal sightings not easily written off, and forever wonder about the strange events experienced by the citizens of Point Pleasant and its neighboring territories.